was a time of sadness, oh my heart, though I knew love the better part, and well I thought was given to me my test of faith and love to be. It seems that I can ne'er be sure the fate to end shall endure. Thus longer trust to all his might, walk by faith and not by sight. I thought the cross I could not bear, for its weight was so heavy there. If I could lay my burden down, I should not fear to lose a crown. Evening shadows seem quiet to tell, and weary though my spirit fell, and then there came a heavenly light as to come my raptured sight. Angelic music filled the air as flighted deities tussled there. Then one who bade them bow the
In the buggy accident. Greenville, about 1900. When Estelle was about 4 years old, her older sisters got a new bicycle, and all the children took turns riding on the handlebars. Riding that day was Pearl Esther, and on the handlebars was little Estelle. As she turned the corner on the street, a passenger buggy happened to be headed toward them. The buggy was going to Turk Lake to pick up passengers. The driver couldn't avoid the bicycle, and they collided, and Estelle was thrown off and run over. The bicycle was twisted into a useless mass, and Pearl Esther was thrown backward into the dirt. Estelle, however, was thrown right under the wheel of the bus. The road was soft and muddy, and the little girl's head was run over by the rear wheel and pushed down into the dirt. A passerby picked up the little girl and took her home, and Pearl Esther ran up and down the street screaming at the top of her voice, "I've killed my sister! I've killed my sister!" All of the neighbors came running up to her to see what had happened. Estelle had a concussion, and her head was so bruised her eyes were swollen shut so badly the doctor was called for another one to help, and they all had a consultation to see what the outcome of the accident would be. They agreed on one thing, and that was that they did not know if her eyes were injured permanently until some of the swelling subsided. The doctors decided definitely that it was a case of severe brain concussion. The doctors and the family felt dread and gloomy prospects. 3 days passed, and in that time Clarence had not changed clothes because he wanted to be at her side. He was still sitting by his little Estelle's bed, and whether he would try to get her up and leave for a few minutes, she would put her hand out to feel if he was still there. Poor Estelle was blind, and she knew it. She could not tell whether it was night or day, and whether she woke up, the first thing she would ask was, "Is it night or is it day?" And it seemed important for her to know. Is it night or is it day? And it seemed important for her to know. She wondered why her father seemed to be crying when he answered her. She asked him, "Papa, why are you crying? I'm going to be all right, but I can't see you. I can't see anything, not even the light. It's so dark all the time, but it isn't going to be dark all the time, is it, Papa?" Estelle could not know whether father's heart was sinking within him, and he would answer, "No, pet, it isn't going to be dark all the time. No, it isn't." Then he would feel better because he knew some of his heart in his Estelle was going to be able to see. It made him feel so much better to say it. Clarence would hold up a shiny object in the light. "Tell me what this is that I'm holding, Estelle. If you can tell what it is, you can have it to keep." Each day it was the same. Estelle would try to open her eyes, and sometimes she could, a little. Each time it was the same answer. "I can't see what it is, Papa. I can't see anything at all, not even the light." Clarence would hold up a shiny object in the light and say, "Tell me what this is that I'm holding, Estelle. If you can tell me what it is, you can have it to keep." Each day it was the same. Estelle would try to open her eyes, and sometimes she could, a little. Each time it was the same answer. "I can't see what it is, Papa. I can't see anything at all, not even in the light." This went on for many days, and finally one day, Estelle had the shiny article in the light. And he said, "Now see if you can tell, Papa, what it is that I'm holding in my hand." Estelle knew her father was desperately waiting for her to answer, and she did want to please him. She tried very hard to open her eyes, and when she did so, they would hurt. She wondered why they hurt so much. She tried again, and finally she could peek out a little bit, so she tried harder and harder. She strained herself until she could just see a little bit. Then she looked very hard indeed, and at last, happily to her father, she said, "I know what it is. I know what you're holding, Papa. It looks like something shiny. It looks like a piece of money, Papa. I think it is a big piece of money, Papa. It looks like it might be a big, big dollar. I can't hardly see it, but it looks maybe it's a dollar." Clarence was beside himself with joy, and he ran up to the little girl and hugged her, until they were both laughing and crying too. He said, my pet, you can see!" Then he gave Estelle the dollar, which she held tightly in her hand. She kept it there every waking moment after that, and spent many happy hours looking at it when she got so that she could see a little better. This was the first anyone knew that Estelle was not going to be blind, and all of the family rejoiced. They all came to see her one at a time, and she rejoiced with them and said to them, "I shall never forget the horror of my not being able to see right from the day, and I shall be all the rest of my life to be happy to God because he made it so that I could see." Although she was only 4 years old, she never forgot what she was temporarily blind, and the incident and the accident made a lasting impression on her mind. Whenever she saw someone who couldn't see, she felt very sorry for them, and she never ceased to thank God the rest of her life that she had her eyesight. Although Estelle had to wear glasses all of her life, she could see. The extra door. Greenville, about 1901. By 1901, the last of the 9 children were born. In 1897, Olive Lillian was born. And 2 years later, brown-eyed Ernest Leslie was born. So the birth of Mary Lucille, with a shock of red hair, was the last. Although the house was large, it was bursting at the seams. The years went on. The voices of children growing up became a cacophony. Quiet moments were rare, for there was always some activity going on. To aid in the care and upkeep of the house, the family hired on a hired girl, one after another, to help out. She was paid the sum of $4 a week, with room and board also. She was supposed to bake bread and clean the house and wash and iron and help with the food carrying. The house always had a hired girl. Everyone raised fruits and vegetables in those days because it was before refrigeration. Everyone raised fruits and vegetables in those days because it was before refrigeration. Canning at the Fries house was a lengthy process, and everyone raised fruits and vegetables in those days because there was before refrigeration. Canning at the Fries was a lengthy process involving all the children. The volume of canned fruit was large, and it consisted of 300 to 500 quarts of fruit every summer. Besides the hundreds of cans, there were several big crocks of dill pickles made. They could be kept and preserved to use later, or give to neighbors. One day, while the family was canning, Clarence came in to tell them about his day at one of his rental homes. The O'Neill family sure is picky about their door being open. Lucinda was canning strawberries, which she did with pride, as she prepared them with skill, and was known for having nice, tasty strawberries. "Strawberries are the free specialty," said Little Doll, who recently liked to be called just Doll. Sometimes they had so many of them that it was necessary to hire pickers. The pickers were paid 2 cents for every quart they picked. The berries sold for 10 cents a quart, or 3-quart boxes for a quarter. Finally, she asked, "How's that, Clarence?" "They have an extra door," said Clarence, "and they don't like having one. It's in the kitchen. I told them to prop up a chair against it to keep it open." "Do you have to rent out houses, Papa?" "No, but since I'm one of the few that do it, I can get more income. Carpenters get paid a bit more than before. A whole $4 a day. If you know, I work 12 hours each day weekly." Lucinda wondered, how much does a house rent for? Usually $7 a month, sometimes 18, although I've never been able to get that high. "Well, you have your ideas and I have mine. I think we could get some more blackberries from the swamps later." "Well, you have your ideas and I have mine. I think we could get some more blackberries from the swamps later." You think that the boys were up to a challenge tomorrow? Clarence wondered. After all, it was getting late, and there wasn't time to go out for the swamp. You think that the boys were up to a challenge tomorrow? Clarence wondered. After all, it was getting late. There wasn't time to go out to the swamps. One had to prepare to go out there, as they had to wear heavy boots and watch out for the snakes. That sounds fun, Papa, Daniel smiled. So Clarence took the boys out to pick berries. A stinky situation. Greenville, about 1902. The Fries boys were always getting into trouble, especially Lee and Roy, who loved to go out on adventures pretending to be brave trappers or chiefs in the woods, or by the high flat river, or at Turk Lake. Lee and Roy spent many happy hours fishing and trapping. They made all the spending money they had by setting traps for mink, muskrat, and whatever they could ensnare into their possession. They trapped the animals, killed them, and skinned them for their hides. They cut boards and stretched the hides out onto them to dry. Usually, there was these hides stretched out on boards plastered all over the barn in various stages of drying process. One day, when the boys were out scavenging in the junkyard for anything they might be able to sell for junk, they found a skunk family, just waiting, as they said, for them to get their hides. They succeeded in capturing a skunk apiece, and after killing them, decided to wait until they reached home before skinning the hides. The two boys came into town with a skunk each, hanging down their backs and tied around their necks. As they headed home, they were gleefully inundated with doors being closed, neighbors shunning them and running in all directions. They were so happy at having skunk hides to see that they never even noticed or thought of the odor they were extruding so magnificently. As soon as they reached their backyard, and before they had a chance to relieve themselves of their expensive loot, the other children playing in the yard ran screaming into the house, yelling for their mother. Mother came out onto the porch, and she did so. She saw that the boys standing there so happily, unaware of the fuss they had made. She took one look at them. Mother came out on the porch, and as she did so, she saw the boys standing there, so happily unaware of all the fuss they had made, and took one look at them. "Now you boys stay right there where you are. Don't you dare move another step." She rushed into the house, and when she came out, she had 2 sets of clothes, 2 towels, and 2 bars of soap. "You go right down to the river right now, and you bury your clothes in a deep hole, and you take a bath, and don't you dare come back until every bit of that skunk odor's off you." The river was only a distance of 2 blocks, so the boys went down there and cleaned themselves up and buried their clothes. In spite of the fact that they had a complete change of clothes, their mother thought she could still smell them a week later. The following morning, just after the skunk incident, the family was up bright and early, but Lee and Roy were up first. They were consumed with thoughts of the skunks waiting to be skinned and stretched on the boards to dry. The following morning, just after the skunk incident, the family was up bright and early, and Lee and Roy were up first. They were consumed with thoughts of the skunks waiting to be skinned and stretched on boards to dry. They thought of lots of change jingling in their pockets from the sale of the hides, giving them an exuberance they thought they'd never experience again. Later in life, they figured even if they had wallets full of folding paper money, it wasn't anything like the ecstasy they found in anticipation of that skunk money. Lucinda seemed to the boys to be unconcerned about how soon the children went out to play, much to the dismay of the boys. Finally, she insisted they must eat their breakfast. Then she checked, as was custom, if they washed their hands and faces and combed their hair before being allowed to come to the table. This made the boys even more dismayed. They couldn't see any sense in such fussiness. This made the boys even more dismayed. They couldn't see any sense in such fussiness, because as impatient little boys, they wanted to go out immediately upon waking. Lucinda didn't tolerate this and demanded they eat properly and do their morning duties before going out. The boys wanted to gobble their food and be savages whenever they could get away with it, which was rare. After all, being mannerly at the table was compulsory, and so this involved someone saying the blessing, and the children acting proper no matter what even if they didn't want to do it. That morning, Lee and Roy exchanged knowing glances as quickly as it could be, and promptly devoured a huge bowl of oatmeal, and promptly asked to be excused. Then they dashed outside just like 2 natives. Well, that's what they imagined they were, anyway. They weren't trying to be offensive, but were, and since there were no Native Americans anywhere around anymore, it was like they were just playing cowboys and Indians. Anyway, Lee was the oldest at 11 and asked his brother, "I'm Big Chief Giveaway. What are you?" "Well, I'm Chief Washerface, and I bet I can beat you to the barn." He was about 7. Chief Giveaway and Washerface proved at last how fast they could run by reaching the barn and nothing flat. Then the two chiefs started to open up the big burlap bag they had carefully concealed under the barn. They dragged it out, and they were overjoyed to find that the 2 beautiful skunks were very dead. The boys knew that they would be dead, because they exterminated the animals the day before. Chief Giveaway pulled out a skunk first, and then Chief Washerface pulled out the remaining one. Like true natives, they'd forgotten their knives, and just as they made the first slice into each skunk, they were interrupted by a scream from Estelle. Estelle was almost 6 years old. She'd run out into the yard to play, and not knowing she was running into native territory, she came up upon her 2 older brothers unawares. "Stand back," Chief Giveaway yelled. "This here is native territory, and anyone coming here within 10 feet is to be scalped right now and fast." Then he began swinging the knife around and yelling, as though he thought a native would do. Ironically, it was so blood-curdling it might have just scared an actual native. Chief Washerface, not wanting to be outdone by a bigger and more bloodthirsty native, began swinging his knife and yelling too. Then he picked up the skunk and swung it around his head and hollered, "Stand back, Paleface, or I'll throw the skunk at you." "Stand back, Paleface, or I'll throw the skunk at you." Estelle not only stood back, but she ran as fast as her almost 6-year-old leg could carry her, and hid around the corner of the house. She peeked out to see what the boys were doing, and was surprised to see that they had put the skunks back down, and they weren't talking aloud. They were just whispering together. A few minutes later, the boys both called to Estelle at the same time. "Come on over, Estelle, and we'll let you have some cents." Estelle knew what pennies were, but she had never owned one. Estelle knew what pennies were, but she'd never owned any, or she cautiously made her way over to the house to the barn. Lee said, "Now I'll tell you what you do, Estelle. You lean way over and smell of a skunk, and you'll get a cent." "I will?" Estelle asked. "Are you sure?" "Yeah, don't you believe me?" "I'm sure." "No," said Estelle flatly. Then she turned to Roy. "Are you sure I'll get a cent if I smell that skunk, Roy?" "Oh, sure," said Roy. "I guarantee you, and I don't..." "Oh, sure," said Roy. "I guarantee you, and I double dare you, in fact. I'll double dare you, and if you don't, you're cowardly." Just then, Ruth happened to be coming down the street. She was a girl Lee's age. Estelle admired her because she had such nice clothes. She was a near neighbor and played baseball and whistled, just like the boys, only she was better at it, and that was just wonderful to a little Estelle. "Hey, Ruth," called Lee, "come on over here." Ruth walked up to the barn and asked, "What do you want?" "Well," said Lee, "we both told Estelle she'd get a cent every time she smelled this skunk, but she doesn't believe us, and she won't lean down and smell one." Estelle looked up out of the corner of her eye at Lee, and then she looked at Ruth and saw that she was very serious when she answered. "Oh, she doesn't believe you, eh?" "No," said Lee, "but she will if you tell her." Estelle asked wistfully of Ruth, "Will I get a cent every time I smell the skunk?" "Oh, yes, you will, honestly, truthfully, and hope to die." Estelle looked carefully at the 3 of them, and then leaned over and smelled the skunk. "Again, again," yelled the boys, and they weren't satisfied until little Estelle leaned over and smelled that skunk at least 7 times. Estelle then said, "I've smelled the skunk, and I want my pennies." "Pennies? Who said anything about pennies?" the boys cried. "We all said you'd get cents, but not pennies. And you have the smells, and they're cents, so that's all you get." Then they laughed, and so did Ruth. Estelle knew something was wrong, but not being old enough to know how to spell, she wasn't just sure what the big joke was. She did know she'd been cheated, and went crying to her mother. Mother came out into the yard where the boys were in time to see Ruth running down the street. She said, "What's going on here? And what's this all about making your little sister smell a skunk for cents? Really is a dirty trick. So every cent of money you get for those hides, you have to give to her. Don't you forget it." Nothing could hurt the boys more than losing good, hard-earned skunk money, and it proved to be the utmost in punishment for them. When the skunk hides were sold, Estelle had some money to jingle in her little purse, and it was the first time in her life she was ever so rich. The big chiefs, no longer so big, went around the house in glum moods, with very sober expressions on their faces, for several days. Stuck in the outhouse. Greenville, about 1902. Ernest Leslie was Lucinda's baby boy, and affectionately her pet. He was 3. He was the only one of the children who had brown eyes. She was also called upon to take his part, because the older boys and their friends seemed to take a special delight in tormenting and teasing him, whenever it was expedient to do so. The older brothers would blame Ernest for everything. They would say he stole the cookies, or he gouged the frosting off the cake, or whatever they'd do to Ernest to, plausibly do it. The result was that although Ernest did a lot of things he shouldn't, he was blamed for many things that he didn't actually do. Only a few homes in Greenville had modern plumbing. Most of the dwellings were built, as was the Fries house, without buildings in the back, alongside the barn, outhouses. Clarence had built his outhouse following the most careful laid-out plans. He'd cut small holes for the children to sit on, and large holes for the adults. One Sunday, Daniel, the older brother, had been told to take little Ernest out to the back. A few minutes later, the most unearthly screams ran through the air from Ernest and Daniel, with nearby, wildly looking for his father and screaming, "Ernest fell in the hole! Ernest fell in the hole!" Daniel explained, "Ernest climbed up that big hole and fell in." What a commotion it caused. With the hole being about 5 feet deep and only a small opening at the top to get him out, it seemed impossible to get him out. Clarence and Daniel were desperate and scared, wondering if they could get the child out before he was suffocated and died. They got a rope and yelled for the child to grab onto it, and they would pull him up. The feat of getting him out of the hole was quite an accomplishment, but it had been done, and such a mess they beheld. Poor Ernest was covered from head to foot with human excrement, and he was wildly crying. Half of the neighborhood, hearing the commotion, had apparently appeared as soon as they heard the screaming. Half of the neighborhood, hearing the commotion, had appeared as soon as they heard the screaming. The townspeople laughed when they saw Ernest, but the family didn't appreciate it at first. The family couldn't see anything funny about the situation, but the neighbors did, and it was the subject of conversation for many months. In spite of many subsequent scrubbings, the whole family avoided Ernest for days. Every time they passed by him, they would sniff him to see if he still smelled, and usually would imagine he did. Oh, God. I remember being told that story. That's pretty gross. That's very, very gross. In the ghost prank. Greenville, 1902. The Fries boys liked to get into all kinds of trouble, as boys often do. One day, there was a shopping to be done, and bread to be boxed. Lucinda set the bread out and started out for town. She told the hired girl to just leave the bread on the back of the stove to rise, and she'd put it into loaves herself when she returned. Now, you don't make any sudden moves and spoil that bread. Go out and play, but don't fuss with the bread, she said to the boys. They said, "Yes, Mom." Daniel grinned. Lucinda turned to the left. When she was far enough away and she couldn't hear them, the boys conspired to do something naughty. "I've got an idea," said Daniel to his brothers. "Let's get some of that bread dough for bacon and pull a prank." Roy smiled. "That sounds like fun. Here's what we're going to do." Yeah, Daniel explained. "Now, get the flour and the water." When Lucinda had finished her shopping and started for home, she got to her street, and when she saw, stopped her. When Lucinda had finished shopping and started for home, she got on the street and saw When Lucinda had finished her shopping and started for home, she got to her street, and what she saw stopped her right in her tracks. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Coming straight at her were 2 bodies and 4 arms and legs and no heads. And the horrors drew closer. She still couldn't figure out what was supposed to be the heads. Then the 2 white blobs of amorphous body mass approached her, but she could still not believe her eyes. 2 of the boys had taken all of the bread dough and smeared it all over their heads and bodies. They made slits out of the dough for the eyes, and they were having great fun smearing everything up and down the street out of their wits. Oh, scaring. They had made slits out of the dough for their eyes, and they were having great fun scaring everyone up and down the street out of their wits. The boys laughed for a few minutes until they noticed Lucinda wasn't laughing. Now look what you did. I have to get new dough. If you ever give me fright like that again, I'll swat you and ground you for a month. Sorry, Danielle felt guilty. But not very guilty. Roy was a little more sorry. Lucinda's lecture convinced the boys not to do it again. Infantile paralysis. Greenville, about 1902 again. One of the children got infantile paralysis, as this was what happened to her. One afternoon in the summer of 1902, the 2.5-year-old baby, Mary Lucille, who was the 9th, was running a high fever and acting strangely. Oddly, it was the current hired girl, Bessie, who first noticed the baby was sick. Mary Lucille was usually listless and had finally collapsed altogether. Mother was weak from stress, recovering from an illness. She could not help much around the house, but when the hired girl reported that there was a problem, she was alarmed and called for the country doctor, Dr. Beck. Dr. Beck was an outspoken man who often liked to curse under his breath. But he was a fine doctor, and the only one for miles. He looked over the child, and his diagnosis sent Lucinda into hysterics and upset the whole household because it was the most dreaded to the family. Infantile paralysis. This baby has infantile paralysis. Her arms and legs are paralyzed. Great doctor. He gave the baby some more tests and said, her tongue is paralyzed too. She'll need the utmost of care to pull through, but I'll do my best. I'm sure eventually she'll be all right. Lucinda was so much more skeptical than Dr. Beck, so he promptly had 2 patients on his hands, and he had to administer a hypodermic to the mother to calm her down before he left. The baby, Mary, did recover from the illness, with no outward evidence of that terrible disease. She had learned to talk all over again and to walk again, and it took so many months to learn all over again that she had learned before. Eventually, she talked with no impediment, and her arms and legs gradually became stronger. Eventually, she was back to normal. During the time she was recovering, the children were jealous of all the attention she was getting, but they got over it. On long summer nights, the children wanted to stay up late, but they were not allowed to do so. The smaller children were displeased that they couldn't stay up late, while the other older children figured out that it was possible to pretend to go to bed and stay up late anyways. Sometimes all of the children had to go to bed early because one of the small children was sick. Such is what happened to this younger one during summer. In fact, one of the older girls, Pearl Esther, formed a dark plot, which they each in turn agreed to. They vowed that when they grew up and got married, they would never have any babies. Pearl Esther said, if it weren't for the baby being sick, we could stay up. She thought it was a shame they were so abused in this manner. All the children, the boys and the girls, solemnly swore they would never have any babies. This pact didn't last long, as later when they married, they had children. So the children weathered the nights of going to bed early in various ways. Eventually, the younger children would grow older, and then be allowed to stay up later and longer with the older ones. The oldest boy, Daniel, would put a sheet over his head and rattle the dog's chains, wave his arms, walk around the bedside slowly. He would say in a spooky voice, I'm the ghost of Christmas past, then wave his arms more and rattle the chains. He would say, in what he considered his spookiest voice, I am the ghost of Christmas present. Then he would make weird noises and try to be as gruesome a ghost as possible. When he was sure that the smaller children were really scared, crying as they hid under the covers, then he decided it was too much for them and would pull down the covers and say, Look, see, it's just me, Daniel. He managed to calm them down, let their complaints were heard downstairs, and we would have been in trouble. He also had felt sorry for them a little when he got carried away. When Daniel wasn't being a ghost, he'd tell ghost stories. And then they would tell spooky stories to see what they could get each other to... Okay. When Daniel wasn't being a ghost, he would tell ghost stories. And they would all tell spooky stories to see whether they could get each other as scared as possible. They often did scare each other silly. And another evening, the boys decided that it would be a great idea to have a pillow fight. It was with great alacrity that the rest of the children agreed with them. Such pillows were flying in all directions. And it all happened that one of the pillows could not withstand such rough and vigorous treatment, so soon a small hole in it soon became a large one. Finally, all of the feathers from it were flying in all directions. It wasn't long before there was nothing left but the empty sack. The children laughed to see the feathers flying and make believe it was snowing. And what great fun it was. The next morning the fun was over because they had to sweep up, brush up, and pick up every feather in sight, and also those not in sight, that Father implicated, and there wasn't a feather to be found anywhere. Then he told them that they should be ashamed to do such a thing when the baby was so sick, and tried to make them understand somebody lived in the house beside them. When he was finished lecturing them, they were indeed ashamed. The next evening, Daniel walked up and down, talking out loud and acting out different parts, that he might be somehow from Hamlet, and the others protested for monopolizing the evening in that manner. Hamlet. They're reading Shakespeare. Well, they're very learned. Oh, excellent. The next evening, Daniel walked up and down talking out loud and acting out different parts. That might be somebody from Hamlet, and the others protested for monopolizing the evening in that manner, and he said, "I have to learn it for school tomorrow." "Is that what you learn in high school?" they asked. "No," he said, "but the old English lit teacher thinks she is the only teacher in high school, and when I get this learned, then she says we got to learn a lot of other stuff from King Lear and As You Like It, and I don't know that at all. I know better than you other children to go to high school. That English lit teacher will be dead." Oh, the other kids all like, so one of the other kids says, "I hope before you other children go to the high school, that English lit teacher will be dead." God. The children all hoped that the teacher was gone, and Hardy agreed. Morbid thoughts seemed to come naturally to the children, and that night was no exception. The baby recovered, and the children got to stay up late again. They were more concerned with The baby recovered, and the children got to stay up late again. They were more concerned with what they wanted to do than with their baby sister, and since they were children, it was all right. The bicycle. Greenville, 1903. Greenville, 1903. When Roy Bartell Fries was 9 years old, his father swapped a watch for a bicycle, and the boys were told they could go for a ride as much as they liked. Knowing that the children had other harrowing bicycle experiences didn't seem to discourage him from getting another one for the children. One of the wealthiest fathers in town had just bought a horseless carriage, or an automobile. The townsfolk called such things newfangled, meaning expensive and new. Scarce indeed were they as a little town, as few had the wherewithal to pay for one. They were a new novelty, in more ways than one. The wealthy man taught his young son, a boy of 15, how to drive the car. One day, when the boy was alone, he got the car out to drive it. Rather uncertainly, Roy was riding his bike, but he was not sure about how to ride it and stay up. The big bicycle was too large for a boy with the short legs. He had to wait until the pedals came up high enough for him to reach them, before he could get a foot on each pedal. Oh, God, no. Trying not to miss the pedals and to steer the bike, it's one of those old-fangled, giant wheel bikes, yeah. Yep. Trying not to miss the pedals and to steer the big bike, almost unmanageable vehicle, resulted in many spills and skinned knees. Just as Roy was making pretty good progress on the bike, he saw a car veering around the corner toward him. He couldn't control the bicycle, and the car driver couldn't control the car, and both crashed into one another. The boy driving the car stopped, frightened at what had happened, and Roy was also frightened. Both of them were crying. Then Roy discovered to his dismay that he couldn't stand up, and the bicycle was twisted, so was his leg, and it was probably broken. At that moment he felt almost as badly about the broken bicycle as he did his leg. A passerby took both boys to the town doctor. Then the broken leg was set, and the fathers of the boys notified. The doctor found the leg had 2 broken places, and each boy was taken back to his respective house, where it was decided that both were reckless and at fault. When Roy was home from school with his broken leg, the teacher at school suggested that each of the 52 pupils write a letter to Roy and tell him they were sorry that he had to stay home. So they wanted to get him a present, and each pupil suggested a suitable present, and he was told to pick what he wanted, and the teachers would see that it was sent to him. Roy had a field day reading all of his letters, and decided that it wasn't such a bad idea, after all, to have a broken leg, even if it was broken in 2 places, and the doctor had said. He finally came to a letter written by a farmer boy, and it intrigued him the most. The letter said that at the farm he had a lot of beautiful big white rabbits, and he thought it would be a fine idea if Roy could like to have one of them. He would be ahead in 2 ways. He'd get the rabbit free, and then he could keep the collection money the teacher had planned to buy something for him with. The more Roy thought about having a big white rabbit, the better he liked the idea, so he promptly wrote his letter to the classmates and thanked them for all their letters. He said he would be happy to have a big white rabbit. A few days later, the teacher called after school, and with her was a very pleased little boy, carrying a cage he'd made himself, and it contained a big white rabbit. The teacher had her arms full of packages of various sizes and shapes, and when she came into the bedroom, she laid all the things on the bed, and with a very cheerful voice she told Roy, The teacher had her arms full of packages, and various sizes and shapes, and when she came into the bedroom, she laid all the things on the bed, and then in a very cheerful voice she told Roy he could wait and open his packages after they left, if he wanted to. Then she said, Look what Jimmy has brought you, and with that shining eyes both beheld the rabbit. They thought he was a beauty, and they said that they had never seen a rabbit so white. Jimmy got the rabbit out of the cage and put it on the big bed. Then it began hopping all over the pillows and onto Roy. Finally, Roy got to hold it, but the rabbit didn't appreciate any affection and wiggled away. When he got away, the rabbit seemed to defy anyone trying to catch him. He was finally caught by Jimmy, put back in the cage, and placed in a chair right by Roy's bed so that he could see him without any trouble. Lucinda served little cakes and fresh milk to Roy's guests, and looked doubtfully at the rabbit. She was obviously not so pleased as the boys about the whole thing. Then, later in the middle of the night, the rabbit somehow got free of his cage. He must have had such a good time. With the morning, evidence of his presence was everywhere. He had tipped over and broken everything in the 4 rooms that he got into. The house had 4 big rooms the rabbit was inclined to hop around in, and he had not missed any opportunity. What havoc he had wrought. When the family got up the next morning, the whole house looked as though a wild animal had been running rampant, as indeed was about the size of it. Lucinda was not the only one who consigned the rabbit to any region outside the immediate vicinity, as all the family agreed with her, except Roy, that a house was no place for that kind of pet. That evening, anyone who wanted to speak to Clarence had to go to his workshop, for he was diligently engaged in making an escape-proof rabbit cage. The Sickening. Greenville, about 1903. One time, the children all got the measles, thanks to an act of curiosity. 3 of the children all came down with the measles at the same time, despite the utmost precautions Clarence and Lucinda had taken to prevent the other 6 from catching it. Dr. Beck had been called to examine them, and he said, Yes, it is the measles. A big placard was immediately put on the outside of the house, which was made of such a bright red as to be seen a block away. It read, Measles, and underneath that, it said ominous-looking words, Keep out. So the family was quarantined, and the 3 sick children were isolated in the front part of the house. The sliding doors of the large dining area were tied shut, and every morning Clarence poured formaldehyde all around and admonished at the children, Never untie the door and go in there, or they would all get the measles too. So every day, the well children eyed the door with longing and wondered what was taking place behind. They saw trays of food go into the forbidden room from a wide door, which was kept locked. The food enticed them. They always looked at the trays longingly and realized they contained better food than they were getting. They called back and forth, and the sick children said they weren't very sick. And everyone, once in a while, they called back and forth, and the sick children said they weren't very sick. And everyone, once in a while, they would even be laughing. And finally, it was too much of a temptation for the rest of the children that weren't sick. And one morning, they waited until they were alone, playing in the dining room. And then the older ones looked at each other, and then they all looked at Ernest. So it was elected to start untying the knots that they found he did so with a sew. And then the older ones looked at each other, and then they all looked at Ernest. So he was elected to start untying the knots that they found that had been done so diligently with alacrity. He was very willing, but found he was unable to loosen them. Father tied them good. He strained much as he tried, but was no use, and a very capable job of not. He was very willing, but found he was unable to loosen them. Father tied them good. He strained much as he tried, but it was no use. The very capable job of not tying had been done. So they all tried and swore each other to secrecy, as they all felt very naughty. It was decided that if they were caught, they would blame it on Ernest, since he was used to such tactics. It never occurred to him to object. Success at last, and they were very surprised when they eagerly rushed into the room. It was dark, and they could hardly distinguish three boys propped up on pillows, and they were squirming and trying to read the current funny papers. Happy Hooligan and Buster Brown and Alphonse and Gabson were their favorites. Well, Alphonse and Gaston. Happy Hooligan, Buster Brown, and Alphonse and Gaston were their favorites. The two windows in the room might as well have not been there, for the shades were drawn clear to the bottom, and not a ray of light could shine through. The children in the bed were a sight indeed, and were so spotted with red dots that the healthy children were quite taken aback, and suddenly they were scared. One by one they all filed out. They were all the same opinion that it hadn't been such a good idea after all to break in as they did. They hoped all the more that they would not be found out, and again swore themselves to secrecy. It wasn't long after them, 5 more children caught the measles, and they were all sick in the same room at the same time. The other children, who had originally planned the escapade, were not very sick, but little Ernest was, and he was that bad that Dr. Beck feared for his life for 2 days. Finally, though, everyone recovered. Near drowning incident. Greenville, about 1903. Ernest seemed to get into a lot of trouble, especially with his big brothers around. The long hot days of summer were a paradise to the children because when school was out, life was spent almost completely out in the sun. They went usually to the flat river 2 blocks away, or one of the many lakes that dotted the vicinity. In the summer of 1903, they had a choice of nearly a dozen beautiful lakes, and the boys especially liked to fish or just drift along on a low rowboat. They could sit in it and dream away the hours, depending on their moods at the moment. One beautiful and very hot summer day, Lee and Roy decided to take little Ernest along with them by the river to play. They usually went on their various jaunts by themselves, as they thought of Ernest most of the time as a pain in the neck and a nuisance. However, this day they were very graciously said that he could come along with them, and of course he very happily trotted along. He strayed mostly behind them, and none of them had the slightest idea of the dire results of the expedition. Everything was an expedition to the boys, and they explored all of the nearby woods, climbing the trees with the intent of robbing the birds of the eggs in their nests. They did it particularly because it was just fun to climb. They liked to catch turtles or fish or do whatever they were inclined to do at the time. This day, they decided that it would be a lot of fun to make a raft. When they started out, they had a hammer and a lot of the largest nails they could find along their father's huge keg full of nails. They let Ernest carry the lunch bag. They didn't trust each other to carry it, as it had been done with disastrous results previously, when cookies and bananas had mysteriously disappeared, despite the boys protesting to each other of innocence. Lee handed the bag to Ernest with these sweet words, "Here, Ernest, you can carry the lunch bag, and I'll break every bone in your body if you ever dare to open it, let alone take anything out." "Me too," said Roy. Ernest meekly took the bag, and he was consumed with curiosity as they walked along, wanting to open it tremendously. With every step, his stomach began to grow with hunger. The boys were always hungry. The three boys trudged along barefoot on the dusty dirt path. On the way, they liked the feel of the hot, dirty sand on their feet. It was wonderful to be so hot and dirty, young, and carefree. When the boys got to the riverbank, they quickly began to assemble all the logs for their raft and began putting it together. Lots of logs were floating along the shore, as years before, this had been quite a logging town. And the boys often heard the oldsters talk about the good old days when logs were floating down the river all the time. The boys didn't comprehend such a time. Since Ernest was only 4, he wasn't useful for anything except to guard the lunch bag, so he did just that. When the raft was finished, the boys pushed and tugged until they got it into the water. Then they hollered to Ernest, "Come on, Ernest, we want you to bring the lunch now, and we'll eat it on the raft." They thought it would be fun to eat the lunch after they got to float down the river, and then they imagined themselves as explorers. They were never just boys, but brave men, for instance, like Daniel Boone or David Livingstone or somebody else, important like that. Someone had previously discarded an oar, and it had seen better days, but the boys used it when they went out on a boat. But that time they had a raft. The boys climbed onto this raft with the oar, and then helped Ernest get onto the middle of it. Immediately, Lee grabbed the lunch bag away from Ernest. It took the boys about 5 minutes to devour its contents, as Lee had dived into it as Lee had divided it into 2 equal parts. And then, very generously, he gave Ernest a cookie. As the 2 older boys munched sandwiches and ate a big banana and 2 or 3 cookies, they explained to little Ernest that they were only being kind to him. "Now, Ernest, you're too little. It'd make you very sick if you ate so much. We don't want you to get sick." Ernest was so used to such things that he didn't put up a fuss, and he knew by this time that it'd be to no avail. He loved his big brothers, and wanted to be just like them when he got big. One thing he especially admired about Lee was the way he took the legs off the big frogs and disintegrated them, and the way he pulled wings off of flies. He liked the way that the time Daniel cut the back off a snapping turtle after first beating its brains out with a big stone. Oh, God. Little terrors. By the time they finished eating, the boys decided it was time to just sit on the raft, so they all stood up on it. They loved the way the smooth, quiet river then felt, and they thought it would be wonderful to stay there forever and never go home. Suddenly, it became difficult to stand up on the raft, and when Ernest wanted to be like his brothers, and stand up on it too, he did nothing but wobble around and couldn't seem to make his bare feet stay where he wanted them to. The raft was wet and slippery, and so were his bare feet. He went over the side so quickly that neither of the boys could grab him to stop him from going. He just quickly, like a flash, disappeared and was gone, his cap floating away from the raft like a silent omen, being caught in the current as it drifted away. Roy and Lee were horrified and scared, and both began to scream as earnest as if their voices could be heard through the depths of the now dark and terrifying water. It was the first time the river had ever looked so foreboding and treacherous to them. They screamed, "Ernest! Ernest!" But for the reply, all they met with their gaze was the rippling of water, which was now circles of bubbles and unfamiliar noises, such as the gurgling and splashing of a tiny body struggling to survive. Roy was only 9 years old and could swim, but he knew he could never save Ernest. Lee was 5 years older and would be 14 in the coming winter, and although he could swim like a fish, as a rule, he wasn't sure he could save Ernest either. However, he took immediate command of the desperate situation. Then, without hesitation, he screamed for Roy to stay put, and he jumped into the water at the point at which the bubbles were rising. He dove down into the water and was seized with cramps for the first time in his life. Eating the food beforehand was a bad idea. He could see Ernest, but couldn't quite reach him. His pain was sudden and intense, and barely made it back to the raft. He cried out to Roy to keep screaming for help. Fortunately for them, a man was approaching. As he came nearer, he saw the cap floating in the water, and then he noticed the boys on the raft. He realized they were in earnest about their cries for help. As he closed in on the boys, they recognized him, and Lee yelled, "Hey, Ray! Hurry, hurry! Ernest is drowning!" The man on the shore proved to be Ray Shields. He was not only a good swimmer, but also a man of action, and he quickly took off his shoes and pants and ran to the water to swim out quickly to the place where he saw ripples in the water. He dove down in and found Ernest, who had come up, and then sunk down for the third time. As he was making for shore with a gasping Ernest, he shouted, "I got him! Go to the shore, quick!" Roy took the old oar and began paddling with it, but it was slow going, and Lee was in too much pain to be of any assistance. When the boys finally got to the shore, they jumped off the raft and ran to where Ray was tending to Ernest. Lee was feeling better by the time, and he was amazed to see what was happening to his little brother. Ray had no idea whatsoever what to do for a drowning boy, and neither did the two brothers. Ray reasoned that if water was inside anyone, the best way to get it out was to just hold up the body by the heels upside down. He figured if a person was standing on his head, then the water would just have to come out. Well, that's what he was doing with Ernest, holding him up by the heels, as the boys watched with fascination as water poured out of him. They claimed afterward that it even came out of his ears. Then Ray began to shake Ernest up and down, still holding on to him by his heels. And then the boys, Ernest would be able to get his lungs cleared and start breathing. He swung him around a few times, and then he laid him on the ground for breath. Oh, Jesus. Oh, God. And then he knew that he was at least alive, which was a big relief. Ray picked up Ernest with his arms and carried him to the nearest house. The couple living there was surprised to see two soaking wet boys and the soaking wet man with a little wide-eyed Roy behind them. They were only too willing to be of help that they could. Although it was a hot day, Ernest was shaking with cold and looked blue and green, and every color except white. He was wrapped in a blanket, and after a few minutes, Roy decided to take him to the boys' home. "We'll get your blanket back then later," he said. "Thanks for your help." Everybody knew that something was wrong when they saw Ernest. Everybody knew that something was wrong when they saw Ernest being carried to the house, and it was at a time that all the house was filled with neighbors. Some wanted to be of service, and others were bursting with curiosity. As soon as Lucinda saw Ernest, she began to wring her hands and cry out, "Oh, my poor baby!" Everyone explained what had happened all at once. Even some folks and the other children who hadn't even seen it. It was always the case at the Fries house. Everyone talked all at once, in the loudest of voices. They seemed to vie with each other to see which one could talk the loudest. Until Lucinda protested that she couldn't hear herself think. It was such bedlam. Lucinda immediately had Roy run for Dr. Beck, and while she was waiting for him, she turned down the big bed downstairs and had Ernest put in it. Then she began to cover him because he was shivering. He thought he had the ague. Dr. Beck was always to the point and blunt, and his arrival assured the family. This was why the children all loved him, because there was never any doubt in anyone's mind with him, that he was very frank to tell you exactly what he wanted to do in no uncertain terms. They never heard anyone swear around the Fries house. They greatly admired the doctor because he knew he was the best doctor in the world, and also because he could swear so beautifully, and he drank beer, and swearing and drinking were never allowed in the Fries house. One of the neighbors of the Frieses was from Germany. Of course. One of the neighbors of the Frieses was from Germany, or Deutschland, where she heard what had happened, and she lost no time in coming over with a tall glass with something hot in it. As soon as Lucinda and the neighbors, Mrs. K, came in with this glass and smiled at her, she asked, "What's in the glass?" Mrs. K had put the glass of hot water in a stiff slug of whiskey and a little sugar added, and since she knew Lucinda was dead against any kind of alcohol at all, she didn't dare tell her what was in it. She looked very innocent and said with a thick accent, "Why, this is medicine, and this is my put. If you put that, give it to him, yeah." Lucinda was suspicious of the contents of the glass and said to Mrs. K, "Well, I've sent for the doctor, and I don't want you to give Ernest a thing. He'll prescribe it for him when he comes." Mrs. K didn't say anything more and set the glass down on the bed. It wasn't long before a knock was heard at the door, and Lucinda herself came to answer it, and she was expecting to see the doctor. She wanted to personally escort him to the bedside of Ernest. As soon as Lucinda left the room to go to the door, Miss K quickly raised Ernest's head of the big white pillow and poured the contents of the glass down his throat. She had to be quick about it as she was Immediately, Lucinda Fries and the doctor walked in, and Miss Kay began to talk to the doctor in German. He'd also come from Germany, and their families were very close friends. She was quite upset because she couldn't understand what they were saying, but she noticed that the empty glass and interrupted the German conversation to ask, "What happened to the glass of whatever that was?" Oh, but Mrs. Kay said, "Oh, I drink it myself," she said. Then she had something in German that seemed to meet with the doctor's approval, and he beamed with pleasure and even went up to Miss Kay and said, "Good girl, good girl. Good Frau, guten Frau, yeah, guten Frau." Yes. Then that's probably what she really said, yeah. Then in his characteristic fashion, the doctor, who was named Beck, began to shoo everyone out of the room. "Everybody out!" he shouted. "Everyone out!" And then he waved everyone out of the room, including Lucinda. She was extremely indigent by being excluded from the sick room. The doctor took one look at the little patient and then stuck his head out the door to swear, "God damn it! Get me a clean teaspoon and bring me a clean glass. And what the hell is everyone doing just standing around?" The boys wanted to be just like Dr. Beck when they grew up, and later on the porch, Lee said to Roy, when I get to be a man, I want to be just like Dr. Beck and drink a lot of beer and swear." Then he asked, "Don't you?" Roy was already serious for his age, and he replied to Lee, "Well, I don't know. The doc plays the violin really good, and I think when I get big I'd like to be like that too. But I also think I'd enjoy it more to play the violin like him than I would to drink beer or swear." "Huh," said Lee, and he walked away and turned back to say, for good measure, "Well, I'm going to drink beer, and I'm going to make sure Ma ain't around, and then I'm going to practice up my swearing." Later that evening, the children got to peek through the door at Ernest, and when they last saw him, he was lying peacefully asleep. He looked up small in the big bed, and for the first time in his life, next to Ray and Dr. Beck, he was the big hero of the day. Picking berries. Greenville, the summer of 1904. One hot summer day, the children decided to go off exploring on their own. Back in those days, children in Greenville were completely safe to go off and roam the countryside around town, as there was no dangerous wild animals and nobody would bother them. Estelle was about 8, Olive was 7, Mary Lucille 3, and Ernest was about 5. About 2 miles out, they came across a big patch of dewberries. The wild berries were black and tasted a little like blackberries. They grew close to the ground like strawberries. They were very hard to pick, as the children had to lean down to the ground to get them. They picked a few to eat, and then went on to the nearby farmhouse to see if the owners would mind if they picked the berries. The farmer's wife said, "We're so busy here and have far more important things to do than to think about a few berries. So if you children want to go ahead and pick them, we don't want them anyway." They were delighted and said they would come back on Saturday. A few days later, when the big day came, Lucinda packed a lunch for them and said, "Daddy promised to pay the children 2 cents a quart for all the berries you pick." The children each had exactly the same lunch, a sandwich, a cookie, and a banana. They started out at 8 o'clock in the morning with a market basket, holding over lunch, and a lot of empty berry boxes. Still, Estelle was the oldest in the group. Her mother told her that she was in charge of the jaunt and to take care of her siblings. In those days, children could just wander through the countryside and not worry about anything happening to them. All the way to the berry patch, they laughed and sang and talked over what they would do with all the money. The most money Estelle had ever had was a quarter, so at the time she was making doll clothes. "I'm going to buy 5 whole yards of baby ribbon for 1 cent per yard and a big spool of basting thread for 5 cents. Ernest said, "I'm going to buy some fish hooks, but I bet you have to have $1 million to buy a rod and reel." I don't know. I guess so. Mary said, "I think it's terrible we children never have enough candy, so I'm going to get some. In fact, when I become a mommy and have children, I will be a millionaire too, and can have a barrel of candy when I just reach in and grab it anytime I want." That was the way things should be. Olive said, "I don't know what I want yet. I have so many things I need. I'll save it." The children finally reached the berry patch, and Estelle decided to leave the lunch basket under a big shade tree where they'd be eaten later. They each took an empty berry box and began picking the berries. They felt very important, and all the while were singing and laughing. The sun began to get hotter and hotter, and the children knew it would be up to 100 degrees in Michigan. They all decided to rest and go sit under the big tree in the shade and eat. As soon as they got to the tree, they looked down a hill and saw a good-sized pig pen with a lot of little pigs in it. They went down the hill to see the pigs closer. They didn't have any at home, and it was fun to watch them. After a while, they decided that they were starving to death and agreed that it was time to eat. Estelle carefully doled out the food, and then when they finished eating, it was put on the berries in the basket and left them under the tree while they went back to pick a few more berries before going home. The children no sooner reached the patch when they heard an unearthly scream, and Mary dropped her berry box and yelled, "A bee stung me!" The children had been told the best thing to do for a bee sting was to spit on it and then put some salt in it, and then it wouldn't swell so much. Ugh. The children didn't really know what to do. Then the children used plenty of spit and no salt, and Estelle said, "We better go home right now." They dashed toward the tree, and then all screamed as baby sister was competition. Some way or another, those little pigs had broken free of the pen and had run to their tree. "The pigs decided to help themselves to our hard-earned berries," Estelle exclaimed. The children gasped in horror at the sight. The pigs had knocked over the basket, and all of the berries were squashed and scattered in every direction. Some were in the grass, and some were in the dirt, and a lot of them had been pushed down the hill by the pigs, who routed all over them with their snouts, and the berries were all wet from them. Estelle was so dismayed that she felt like joining little Mary with tears, but she assured them, "Let's scoop the berries up and take them home, so they'll know we picked them, and we know how many boxes we each picked, so we can still get our money." Mary just sat and bawled, and the rest of them scooped up so many berries as was possible and could get dirt and all. So the children left the home for Mary's bee sting, kept swelling up, and more she cried. They were all tired and exhausted. When the children trudged home, Estelle placed the basket of soggy, dirty, wet pig snout, contaminated berries on the table. The mother was the first to greet them, and said her mission was not seeking the berries, but attending to the bee sting. She had plenty of both spit and salt, and soon had her baby calmed down enough that she quit bawling. And then she looked at the berries and heard the sad tale of woe about the pigs. They thought she'd be upset, but no, she began laughing. Laughing was the ultimate of insults. It made Estelle mad for a little bit. Mother was the first to greet them. Their first mission was not seeing to the berries, but attending to the bee sting. She had plenty of both spit and salt, and soon had her baby calmed down enough that she quit bawling. Then she looked at the berries and heard the sad tale of woe about the pigs. They thought they would be upset, but no, she began laughing. That was the ultimate of insults, and Estelle was mad for a bit. Clarence came home and heard the sad story, and he laughed. "You children can have your money anyways. These pigs were probably just hungry and all." And Estelle said, "I don't think it was funny." Lucinda smiled, and she tended to the bee sting on the little one. "Well, it was funny. You'll laugh about it later, dear." Estelle supposed there was something funny after all. Estelle supposed there was something funny about it after all. And now you've just read a rendition of that funny story right now, over a century later. So there you go. It was funny. So. Storefronts. Greenville, 1904. Clarence felt... I immediately screwed that up. Scene 21, Storefronts. Greenville, 1904. Clarence Fries. Wow, what can I say his name? Scene 21, Storefronts. Greenville, 1904. Clarence Fries seemed to always be one step ahead of others, except for his children, especially when it came to eating. He worked in the summer months and brought home essentials for the family, as was his obligation. As the children grew older, it took longer to make ends meet. However, in some cases, Clarence could make ends for doing work, in exchange for bread, baked goods, or his favorite ice cream. Two of the food stores in town decided simultaneously to have new storefronts built. They wanted to have them finished before the cold weather set in. Clarence Fries was contracted to do the work, and he began at once. Clarence built the storefronts and had them all finished in time and shape for the owners. As his work was completed, and he was ready to hand them a bill for service, Clarence built the storefronts and had them all finished and in fine shape for the owners. After his work was completed, all was ready to hand them a bill of service, rendered. The owners both told him the same story. The first owner said, "Now I have a bakery here, and you have a rather large family. We can't get together, and you will take out the money in trade. I think that deal would be nice for the two of us. What do you think?" The other was a confectionery store that had ice cream of many flavors and all kinds of candy. Clarence loved ice cream and candy. So when the owner said, "Why don't I offer you free ice cream instead of payment? That way you can get to have all the ice cream you want all summer. You can invite your friends too." "I'd like that idea," Clarence replied. Basically, he's getting free work. It's like, oh well. Clarence began computing roughly how long it would take for him to get his money as the ice cream parlor. He knew that the back of the big ice cream sundae was 10 cents, so he get almost limitless free ice cream. Word got around that the Fries family got free ice cream or candy, which did not take long. By the following day, all of the children at school knew about the ice cream, and that they went along with a Fries boy or girl, it was free. I bet they made... The children suddenly had friends they didn't expect. In fact, the Fries children were suddenly the most popular in town. They could just go to the store and say, "I'll have some ice cream cones and some of this or that." With new friends popping up every day, the children had a marvelous social life, although it was because of the free candy. No one child in town would say anything to upset them, and everyone was very good friends. The children shared their wealth and their newfound friends for 2 weeks. All too soon, the bonanza, as the children considered it, was just gone. No one was more surprised than Clarence when he went to the ice cream parlor to buy himself a sundae. It was the first and only day that he'd ordered for himself. The problem was that the children had consumed the entire payment in ice cream. "I would like a sundae, please." The owner took him aside and said, "The money for the free ice cream has run out, Clarence." "What, already? Your children and all their friends have been here for weeks, eating so much ice cream I had to make more." "Oh dear," Clarence replied. Then the store owner showed him a list, and it was all there in black and white. Children from all over town had been helping themselves to the Fries tab, and it had run out. The itemized list was so long that it took several sheets of paper to fill it out, but Clarence had no way of checking, so he just took the owner's word for it that the money was indeed gone. "Well, I still want a sundae." "Well, that'll cost you 10 cents. He got his sundae, but he had to pay for it. A dime for it. At the bakery, things were not much better. Clarence went there to get some bread and pastries, but it turned out the children had been there too. The owner shook his head. "I kept some loaves, about a dozen, but the children had used up your tab." "Here too?" "Yes, sir. There's become real popular lately." It was true. The Fries children were just as popular at the bakery, that every child who knew them had a great craving for cookies and cinnamon buns. The children were just too happy that they could help satisfy their appetite, and those of their friends. It seemed that the children were eager to eat everything in sight. Clarence didn't care as long as 12 loaves of bread were held for him every Saturday. Since bread was 5 cents a loaf, and cookies were 10 cents a dozen, it meant that a lot of bookkeeping for the baker. The list increased daily. Every Saturday night, Clarence Fries called for the bread, and every Monday morning, there was not a crumb left. The family had to have pancakes for breakfast on Monday mornings because of this. The Fancy Lady is a Ruse. Greenville, 1902 to 1906. This is the story of the Fries family's visits with a girl named Annie Sterling, who was quite a sight to see. Lovely blonde Annie impressed them with her fantastic stories. The Fries thought Annie was the most gorgeous creature they had ever met, and the most wonderful. In those days, anyone who looked and acted proper and wealthy was considered so by the Fries family. It was so impressive in those days to have fine clothing and appear well-to-do. It all started 4 years earlier when the 4 oldest Fries children, Dan Porter, Pearl Esther, Elva, Doll, and Lee Oliver, were all teenagers and had gone to a party. The party was at the high school, and one of the girl students brought her cousin to the party, who was visiting her at the time from Grand Rapids. Anne was introduced to the 4 Frieses, and they once took an immediate liking to her. And Pearl was almost awestruck at the first glance. They had never seen anyone 14 years old or so elaborately dressed from head to toe. Annie was something to see. The 2 Fries boys' impression of Annie was the same. She was gorgeous, And while she had an extremely pleasant smile and manner, she at the same time had an elusiveness about her, which made them both feel she was way beyond their reach and unattainable, like a princess of the royal blood. Annie was everything, to the Frieses were not. They knew that they would never be able to hold a candle to her, as none of them have outstanding beauty. And Annie was a blonde curly hair was tossed at will, and big blue eyes, which she rolled also at will. It seemed that she tossed and rolled most of the time. She was tiny and looked like a Dresden doll. Anne said to Pearl, "I am happy to have met you, and your sister, and your 2 brothers. Are there any more in your family?" "Oh, yes," said Pearl. She replied, "We have 9 in our family." "9," said Annie, unbelievably, and then again, "9. Why, that must be wonderful. I'm the only one in my family. I'd love to meet all of them." "Why not?" Pearl replied. "Come on over to the house before you go back home, and we'll all be glad to see you." The next day, Annie came over with her girlfriend, which was also her cousin, and as soon as the rest of the family met her, from the aged Grandpa Fries down to little Mary Lucille, who was a toddler, they all fell in love with Annie. After visiting for a while, the blow fell. Annie herself told them, "My cousin is moving away from Greenville, and I guess I won't be seeing any of you folks again." The protests were loud and long, and everyone at the same time had the same thought. Why couldn't Annie come and visit them in the summer, when the school was out? Even if she had a cousin to see, she could visit with the Frieses, and why not? Why not, indeed? Said you visit? Why not, indeed? And this is how it came about that the first thing, when school closed for the summer, the following term, the Fries finally received a letter from Annie. Specifically, it was properly to the Fries collectively, as she was in that way she had addressed it. To the Fries family of Greenville, Michigan. The mailman looked at the letter before dropping it in the Fries mailbox. He remarked to himself that it was the first time he'd ever seen a letter addressed that way. Strangely for him, he wondered what might be in it. The Fries opened the letter with enthusiasm, as they'd never waited any time at all to wonder when the letter was from. Instead, they always had it open, as though it were the only one they had ever received, and inadvertently they would look to see the significance before they read it. No, there was never any doubt in their minds as to who had been writing them. Annie's letter was exactly like her, dainty and appealing. It read, "Dear wonderful Fries family, I would so much like to come and visit you, and now that the school is out, I should like to know if it's all right if I come right away. I can make a short visit. I can only stay a month, so as long as my folks will be touring in the West. Please let me know if the standing invitation is still standing. Love to all of you, Annie." Since Pearl Esther had met Annie first and was the same age, she felt as what up. Since Pearl Esther had met Annie first and was the same age, she felt it was up to her to mail a reply. Although the whole family had a conference, and they all agreed that it was the most wonderful thing in the world to have Annie visit. The day Annie Sterling was to arrive was such a great flurry of activity over that it was a priceless person was coming. No one was a princess. The day Annie Sterling was to arrive was such a great flurry. The day Annie Sterling was to arrive was such a great flurry of activity, as if a princess was coming. No hand was idle, and everyone pitched into clean and polish and shine until the house inside and out could meet a critical eye. It was the first time in history that the lawn had ever been mowed without protest. With all was in readiness, each criticized the other until everything was in perfect vigor and love could make it. The distance to travel from the railroad station to the house was only 5 blocks, but the family decided nothing was too good for Annie, and they would meet her with the surrey. Horse and buggy. The horses were never hitched to the surrey with a greater will, and it was decided that Daniel, Lee, Doll, and Pearl would meet the train. On that way, the air was filled with expectancy, and the sun never did shine brighter on that day, or seem more perfect. Just before the train pulled in, Daniel turned to Lee and said, "You know, I'll bet even our horses will be impressed when they see Annie." Lee thought that Daniel had lost his mind, and wasted no time in saying so. "You might be nuts," he said cryptically. That was a very mild statement for him. Later that evening, the 5 girls of the Fries family, Doll, Pearl, Estelle, Lillian, and little Mary, were crowded around Annie's suitcase to watch her unpack. Never before had they seen such an array of finery. Since most of their underwear was made of flour sacks, they had often wondered if each was ruefully, "We have to be careful when we bend over, or people would see gold medal across our rears. Not so with Annie. She had yards and yards of silk on all of her underthings, and wonder of wonders, she had a pair of black lace pants. It was the first time any of them had ever heard of black ones, and they certainly had never seen any made of lace. When they oohed and awed about each thing Annie extracted from the depths of her large suitcase, Annie just laughed and was very nonchalant about it all. She did say, however, all of my things are from Paris, France. And no one doubted her for a moment. She might have been just amused that she had the smaller girls later playing a game that they'd made up. It consisted of turning around and around in the chairs and singing, Annie's pants are from Paris, France. Yes, Annie's pants from Paris, France. It was sung pianissimo, which is unusual for them, and they felt very naughty. Each summer, the lovely blonde Annie Sterling spent time at the Fries residence. Her visits became longer, and by the fourth summer, she was 18. It was the last summer with the family that Annie had been invited to stay the entire summer vacation of July and August. Her letter in June had been typical. Dear adorable Frieses, the last 3 summers I have stayed 4 to 6 weeks at your lovely home, and this summer I should like to stay the full 8 weeks. My folks will now be touring the continent, and will be gone exactly 8 weeks. Please let me know if you're right, as my folks would like to make their plans for their tour without me. Love you all, Annie. As ever, the Fries family was collectively happy that Annie was going to spend the summer with them. The first big night of Annie's arrival, the 5 girls were again watching breathlessly to see all Annie's new finery. By now, they too had less sturdy material for their unmentionables, but never ever would they be able to complete. By now, they too had less sturdy material for their unmentionables, but never were they ever going to compete with Annie in that regard. All of the yards and yards of lace sewed onto Annie's things were done by hand, and she still insisted that, as usual, that her things were handmade in Paris, France. She went on at great length at this time to explain about her folks. They're going to tour the continent. Isn't that wonderful? Of course, they've been all over the United States. They were impressed with her story, honestly, and thought it was wonderful. Since none of them had ever been farther away than Grand Rapids, they thought Annie's folks were nothing short of millionaires. They never ceased to be amazed she came from such a wealthy family. How come she was so sweet and unassuming? They thought millionaires must be extremely rude to everyone, high and handsome, and couldn't imagine them being civil to a poor person. The Frieses had never seen a millionaire, and never expected to, and they had their own ideas about how they behaved. After 4 years, they still were a bit in awe of Annie, and very much in love with her too. After 4 years, there still was a bit in awe. After 4 years, they still were in a bit of awe of Annie, and very much in love with her too. That summer, Annie Sterling seemed a bit more quiet than usual. She finally broke down the family at dinner one night. Well, you're all here at the table. I have some news for you. News, now what? Annie thought. A million eyes were looking at her. And without any preface, Annie said, I'm going to be married in October, and my folks will send you a formal invitation to come. No one had ever thought much about Annie's love life. She was so much like one of the family, and yet they really didn't know her at all. Whenever any of the local boys wanted to take her out on a date, when she let them know that her preference was Daniel, but she treated him exactly like a brother, and that was fine with him. Daniel always told everybody that Annie would never marry anybody unless they had $1 million, and he thought that's what a date would be likely cost, which he didn't have. He still was a little in awe of Annie, and he knew he would never have $1 million. At Annie's announcement, the whole family began talking all at once because they were all astonished. They were pleased for her and pressed her for the facts. They wanted to know everything. Who was her future husband? Was he rich? How old was he? What did he do? Annie Sterling met all questions calmly and answered with her usual quiet dignity, aplomb, and highly colored imagination. She said he's 19, adorable, and naturally his parents are very wealthy. In fact, he's with his folks now in Europe. He's touring the countryside with my folks, and they will arrive in New York together October 1st. I will meet them at the dock. Annie could do no wrong, as the family saw it, so they agreed to attend the wedding without any doubts in their minds. The summer came and went, and as the colors of fall turned the town colorful and fallen leaves, and the trees became bare of leaves, and the family knew it was October. During the second week of October, the mailman delivered another letter, which was addressed to the Fries family. This time, the letter was an engraved invitation inviting them to the wedding of Annie and her husband, Timothy. This was the first time any of the family had ever received an invitation so stylish. The children were impressed. Clarence said, "You can just tell this is engraved because you can feel the letters stamped on it." Clarence said, "You can just tell this engraving because you can feel the letters stamped to it." The children looked with awe as they figured their father knew such things because he was an adult. Clarence took charge of the whole affair. He said, "Now, we don't want to know our ignorance. After all, we don't want to appear uneducated in socializing." He then explained to the family that an invitation should be answered in the same manner it was given. He completely ignored the fact that the children learned such things in high school. He went on to say that if an invitation was formal, it required a formal reply. He then sat down and prepared an acceptance. He thought his speech was so well written, after the discerning eye of his mother. The invitation was sent, and Clarence decided on who should be going. He knew that it would cost too much for the entire family to go, so he decided that he would go with Lucinda, and the children would be left with the grandparents. So the grandmother's still alive? I guess his parents. Yeah. Okay, yeah. One of his is yeah. So they're gonna be Clarence and Lucinda. Okay, I'm gonna have to clarify something in here. Oh, that's great. Clarence wished that his late mother could see him write the letter to Annie. The following evening, Clarence and Lucinda looked over the wedding finery in the catalog of Mr. Sears and Mr. Roebuck. Clarence decided that he would send for a fancy outfit, as his one would have made him look like a judge or a minister, and it amused him. He ordered a new silk hat, a swallow-tailed coat, and striped pants. The family all agreed that he ought to look good enough to go to the wedding of a millionaire's daughter in that getup. Lucinda decided to order a rich-looking taffeta that should be able to stand up on its own. She picked out a lovely plumed hat that would have done credit to Lillian Russell, who was a famous person back then. The person was a stage actress and fashion magnate of the time. After the orders were completed, they had to decide on a suitable wedding present. Sears and Roebuck were pursued again, and what Clarence would think was suitable, Lucinda would reject. "We can't give that to Annie." It was decided that anyone that didn't look fancy wasn't proper for someone as impressive as Annie. Finally, they decided, one morning, they would give them dishes. Even though the catalog called them morning dishes, the family didn't know what it meant, but it sounded important. Lucinda liked collecting dishes in containers from auctions, whenever business of hotels closed in the area. The Fries dishes were therefore hand-me-downs and not anything special. When Annie came to visit them, Lucinda would put out her best dishes. Clarence wrote the order for the fancy dishes and had them sent to the Sterling's address in Grand Rapids. So they live in Grand Rapids. A few days later, the large packages arrived containing the new clothes for the wedding. Lucinda eagerly unpacked them, careful as not to damage the outfits. It was quite an occasion. Lucinda couldn't wait until Clarence got home to try to get her finery, and she immediately put on her new fancy, well-plumed hat. Everyone laughed and said, "Now how in the world can you get your dress on when you put on that hat first?" So then the hat came off and things were put on in their proper order. Lucinda felt like a picture in a book, and she looked very elegant. When Clarence came home, he too was eager to see and try on his outfit that he had selected, while the children waited to see them all dressed up. Clarence came out with his fancy suit and his new tall silk hat on. The children all thought he looked like a minister, and he said, "Well, I guess the old millionaires won't have anything on me." Just for good measure, he had the children hunt all over until they found his grandfather's gold-handled cane, and then he paced up and down the house, pretending to twirl his cane and carrying gloves at the same time. He never wore gloves in his life, but he said that he wouldn't be seen at a wedding without some. And when he made out the order for the gloves, he didn't check the size, and the gloves were just for his pocket. He didn't intend to wear them. He laughed to himself when he wrote his orders and wondered if Mr. Sears and Mr. Roebuck would have any thoughts when they saw it. The day of the wedding finally arrived, and the Fries took on the morning train to Grand Rapids, which was the big city. Since there was no time to dress after they arrived, they had to dress up before they left home. Clarence didn't care, as he thought it would be fun to fool the passengers into thinking that he was a big shot when he got off the train. Lucinda demurred more because she was afraid that she'd be messed up en route. However, It just wouldn't do for one to dress up and not the other. Anyway, they would arrive just barely in time to meet the family and have a few minutes to chat before the scheduled wedding. The wedding and reception was both held at the bride's parents'. As soon as they reached Grand Rapids, the Fries took a taxi and went to the address given them. When the taxi stopped at a rather dismal and decrepit house, Clarence thought it to be a mistake and checked with the driver. He assured him that was the correct address. A tall and rather brusque man greeted Clarence and Lucinda at the door. Then they were brought to the parlor and introduced to everyone around as Annie's friends from Greenville. The man said that he was Annie's father, Chet Sterling, and appeared to have her grace and manners, but we got used to the folks. However, he looked nothing like her. A few of the guests told Clarence that he thought he was a minister at first, but it was no wonder because he took a bit of a glance to see that Clarence Fries was the only one among several associated guests who were dressed up at all. It was the same with Lucinda. No one surpassed Lucinda Fries's sartorial splendor. She didn't know whether to be amused or angry. She finally decided to just make the best of things and let it go at that. Lucinda saw a lot of anxious fluttering and scurrying about that day. Annie's mother, Esther Sterling, finally appeared from the kitchen and appeared to be extremely flustered. She looked exactly like her daughter. She was dressed in blue lace. There was a very nervous young lady who was playing the wedding march. I'm assuming on a piano. She wore a very frothy dress with a lot of tuffle. The piano was old and out of tune. Oh, ooh, ouch. Nothing like an out-of-tune piano. Clarence and Lucinda were totally astonished with the flurry of activity and the obviously disheveled lack of elegance in the Sterling showed. Annie had come down the open stairway in the arm of her father, and everyone looked with her in awe. She was like an angel dressed in white, and all the drama of the wedding preparations melted away for a moment. The groom was plain-looking. His name was Timothy Forrest, but he said nothing to Clarence or Lucinda. They did not recall anything he said upon their return. Clarence figured that Annie's folks didn't exactly lie to them. Annie was the one who lied, and made up all those stories. Once the air was cleared, he felt better about it, although he could tell Lucinda was just itching to complain about the whole time. Lucinda knew that the Sterlings were doing their best to be polite, but that it was a strange wedding, and she couldn't shake the idea that she'd been tricked by them, not just Annie. Clarence and Lucinda pondered their problems and decided to make the best of it, and sleep in that back room without complaint. That turned out to be a very bad idea, as it was infested with bugs. The next morning, the family went out to the station to pick up the folks. The disheveled Fries parents were so tired and sore-looking, they were almost mistaken for two other people. One look at them and the children all screamed, "What in the world happened to you?" Lucinda was so mad that she couldn't talk, but Clarence could talk, and he did. He talked so fast it was hard to keep up with him. His face was swelled up and his eyes were all swollen. He could barely open them. Mother was a sight to behold. Her beautiful hat looked grotesque and decidedly out of place on her swollen face, and she looked up as though her nose was put on backward. "You see, it was like this," said Father. "We were the only guests from out of town, and they only had one back bedroom where we could sleep. So they told us to stay there for the night. Well, the room was musty. To say it was a spare room is about right. It was spare, all right. Not much in it but the bed and a dresser. Oh, their house was not even ordinary. It was less than ordinary. Annie's father's a nice enough guy, but he travels most of the time, and I guess he doesn't make too much money. Annie's mother is a dressmaker for a lot of ritzy folks, and she sews all the time and doesn't get out much. Says she's never been out of the state of Michigan. And that back room, well, it looked pretty dreary, but you didn't know the half of it, for we never got a wink of sleep. I never knew there were so many bedbugs in the world, and I do mean bedbugs. It was terrible. I sat up the whole night squashing them. Clarence tried to laugh then, but it was a bit difficult for his swollen face, and then he said, Lucinda was pretty mad, but I found some straight pins, and every time I come to a bug that was nice and fat, I stuck a pin right through it. So you know what, I lined them up in a row, left them on the dresser. Contend them that I stuck 27 bugs in a row. If I had a plumbing line, it couldn't have been any straighter. Yes, sir, I left the row of dead bugs with a pin through each one on them, and they won't be able to miss seeing them. I can tell you, believe me, we didn't wait until eat breakfast. We just got out of there. And that was the exit of Annie, who had been the beautiful hair and clothes, but also was actually a flawed jewel like everyone else. Her wild imagination couldn't cover them up for the wedding day. Around that same time, when it fits into this, Clarence had been given a copy of the poem his sister had to Annie as a gift, and it was later published in the church collection in 1904. Clarence didn't know that his sister actually didn't write it, but had copied it from a book from long before. It didn't really matter, as here was different enough. Even so, when Annie put it in the church paper, she had signed anonymous, so that she would not bring herself to claim it was hers either, as she loved the Frieses, but Clarence never told her about it. She gained no notice from it. Even so, a version of the poem survived until a second publication in the 1930s by her daughter, a certain Miss Hulbert of Michigan. It is also possible that Annie sent them a copy of the 1904 church paper from where it had been reprinted, and Clarence proudly displayed it for all to see. Clearly, if a 1930s version also appeared, it too was in the family. Look at this here. This is the poem my sister copied. I had it framed from the church bulletin where Annie now lives. She's a friend in the family who had put it into print, he might have said. The Hired Girl. Greenville, 1906. The new hired girl didn't understand how things worked at the Fries house. She was not very good with English, so as indeed did not understand what Lucinda was telling her. This caused a most amusing baking incident. Everyone, including the smallest of the children, had said goodbye to Rosalind, who had been the hired girl for 5 years. She just left to be married to a young farmer who lived just on the edge of town. Lucinda had advertised in the local paper for a hired girl, and among several applicants for the place was a young girl from Denmark. She knew that whoever got the job would have to be a girl with tremendous courage, a liking for children, and a strong back. Lucinda liked Emily at once and hired her on the spot. She felt a pleasant sense of responsibility toward her, as the girl had only been in the U.S. for about 5 months, and could speak very little English. She couldn't read English at all, and Lucinda told her she could learn as the time went by, and the children would teach her to read. Emily was to start work in the following morning, and all of the family talked about it before that they went to bed that night. Lucinda was saying, "Now I want you children to be on your best behavior, so no sassing and no finding fault. Emily isn't able to speak English very well, and if we were in her country, none of us could talk at all, so you'd better mind your manners." By the time the children were more or less accustomed to being bossed by the oldest ones, so it came to no surprise that Doll piped up, "You and Mama look at..." By that time, the children were more or less accustomed to being bossed around by the older ones, so it came as no surprise when Doll piped up, "Yes, and Mama, look how disgusting the boys eat. They eat way too fast, and Ernest actually gobbles. Why, you have to teach him better manners." Lucinda looked severely at Ernest and said, "And you especially, Ernest, will have to watch out. If I find you finding fault with one single thing at this table, you will be asked to get up immediately and leave, and no nonsense." Ernest looked around meekly and felt that everyone was picking on him, but he was used to it, and it didn't say anything. The next morning, as soon as Emily, carrying out her old bag with a few belongings, and Lucinda took her first upstairs and showed her where she was to sleep and to keep her personal things. Then she showed her all the rest of the rooms upstairs and explained carefully which room belonged to whom and who slept in them. Having returned to the downstairs, Lucinda explained about each room there. After that, they went out into the yard, and Mother showed Emily the large vegetable garden and all of her flowers and made special mention of the rows of beehives. "These beehives are all around the raspberry bushes, but you needn't worry about them. If the bees are left alone, they leave you alone. Anyway, the children picked up the berries, so you'll never be expected to do that." Lucinda then took Emily into the main kitchen and showed her the big cupboard Clarence had built, where everything was kept. She kept a big kitchen cabinet, which she called the baking cabinet, and was used mostly for convenience of baking pies and cakes and other goods. She opened all of the bins and cupboards and showed Emily where everything was. Then she took her into the next room and said, "The room we call the summer kitchen. Out here is where we store stuff, and that big stack of berry boxes, piles of honey, just as is taken from the hives, and bushel baskets for the peaches, pears, and etc. In the winter, this room is like an ice box, and that's exactly what it's used for. Everything here freezes solid, and will keep meat out here all winter. Rabbits, beef, pork, eggs. My husband usually buys a side of beef and a whole hog and gets lots of rabbits and fish." Oh, etc. I should probably say that better. I'll say that again. In the winter, this room is like an ice box. That's exactly what it's used for. Everything here freezes solid, and we keep most of it all winter. Rabbits, beef, pork, etc. My husband usually buys a side of beef and a whole hog and gets lots of rabbits and fish. Whenever we want beef for dinner, my husband takes a cleaver, a big sharp knife, and a saw, and he saws and cuts it by the stove and thaws it out. You won't ever have to cut the frozen meat, as that's my husband's job, and he always expects us to do it himself. He won't let the boys do it, as he thinks no one can do it with the safety he can. And anyway, it's just pretty hard to cut off a piece of solidly frozen meat. Since it was summer, Emily wondered why she was told about what happens in the winter. But she didn't seem to indicate that the conversation was unusual. She only understood about half of what was explained anyway, since her knowledge of English was so vague and limited. She kept nodding her head and indicating that she understood what was being said to her, and that was sufficient. You won't have to do any washing, Lucinda went on, because I has the same washing woman for 7 years now, and there's no reason to believe that she won't be washing for 7 years more. You will, however, be expected to do the ironing, and I like to have that done exactly every Wednesday. And now, said Lucinda, we'll get down to business, and I'll tell you exactly what you are to do. First, and right now, you will go upstairs and make the beds. That is all you will do, just make the beds. Understand? Emily nodded and plodded upstairs. Lucinda was so afraid she wasn't sure what she was going to do, that she plodded right upstairs after her and showed her what she was to do. She pointed to the unmade beds, and Emily seemed to get the idea. She just began to make them up, and when Lucinda saw that she knew what she was doing, she just quietly left and went downstairs until Emily should come down. As soon as Emily came downstairs, Mother said to her, Now all you have to do the rest of the day is to make the dinner, do the dishes, and then you can have the rest of the afternoon off. You just have to make supper and have it ready by 6 o'clock. Then you'll do the dishes, and then you are done for today, understand? Emily nodded. Lucinda went out and got the little wind-up alarm clock and pointed to 12 o'clock noon. That, she told Emily, is when we have our dinner. I want you to fix baked beans, baked potatoes, and sliced tomatoes, and then... Lucinda stopped and was worried. Did Emily know how to make apple pie, she wondered? She showed Emily the 6 pie pans and all the apples and asked Emily, Do you know how to make apple pie? Emily just nodded, but heard and indicated she knew how to make pies. Lucinda explained to Emily that she had a certain pan she always used to make the beans in it. It's behind the door, she said, and it's a big round pan, and it has a hole in each edge and hangs on a nail behind the door. She just pointed vaguely toward the door, but Emily just looked at all those apples to be peeled and not at her. Just before Lucinda Fries left the kitchen, she called out, Now another thing, Emily. The other girl left a bit of pie dough. You can add that to your dough, as it's very good dough. And we just had it there yesterday. It's all rolled in a big ball, and it was in a cup. But she didn't tell Emily was that the other most identical ball was in a saucer on the first shelf. When Emily found both balls, she put them in the pie dough. And while the ball of stuff on the saucer didn't look exactly right, she thought she'd use it anyway, or thought it must be pie dough also. Emily had 3 hours in which to fix the dinner, and she began to peel the apples, while the beans were boiling. It was the largest kettle of beans Emily had ever seen in a private home, and it was wondered how many were in the family. It must have been 3 or 4 pounds of beans. Emily decided that she also noted the big slab of salt pork on the kettle. They must have had 3 or 4 pounds of beans, Emily decided, and she also noted that the big slab of salt pork on the kettle. It must weigh about 4 or 5 pounds, too. She was going to cut it into strips when she got ready to bake the beans, and cut the salt pork in rows across the top of the pan. When Emily got ready to bake the beans, she couldn't for the life of her find the pan they were to be baked in. She looked behind the door of the baking cabinet and noted the pan there on the nail. Then when she opened the door to the summer kitchen, there was a slightly larger pan of the same general size and shape until it too was hanging on the doornail. Emily took the pan off the nail from the summer kitchen door and noticed it looked rather dusty. She scrubbed and scoured the pan, and all the while she was thinking it looked like an awful big one to bake beans in. At 11:30, Lucinda came to the kitchen and told Emily it was time to set the table. She said, There are 12 to eat, my husband and I, and 9 children, and you and I make 12. It became 12 o'clock all too soon, but Emily observed with satisfaction at the row of 6 nice-looking apple pies. Now she opened the oven, and the beans looked as delectable brown, and the fork, which she barely pushed into the potatoes baking, went right through, then she knew that they were all well done. The family began gathering into the dining room, and they saw the table all set and the dinner ready to eat. Emily had not set a plate out for herself, so Lucinda went directly to the kitchen and said to her, "Now listen, Emily, you're not going to sit here in the kitchen by yourself. You just bring the plate setting, and you're going to eat with us. We want you to feel like one of the family. And we don't think you're a bit better than you are. And you're just going to come right here and sit down and eat." Emily demurred a little, and Lucinda said, "Nonsense, come in and eat." As soon as Emily came in, plate, all of the family was introduced to her. Everyone was most cordial, and Emily soon forgot to be ill at ease, and she thought that she was going to like this place very much. Everything was fine until it came to eat the pie. Naturally, Ernest was ready for his piece first, so he wasted no time and first at the table. Lucinda Fries told Emily to cut the pies, and put every piece of the pie plate and set it out to each piece before dinner. They never had any doubt what was first for dessert, and the whole meal, including dessert, was all set on the table at the same time. She always thought such a big family, and it's too much to do, to be fussy about serving in courses and meals. She used to say, if the Queen of England came to eat, she would serve the same way. Everything on the table at the beginning of the meal. Mother knew it was the most remote possibility in the world, but it was a favorite expression of hers. While she was most fastidious in her dress and manners, she did not have an ounce of shame in her body, and they only stressed style at a certain point. As soon as Ernest tasted his pie, though, he turned white and swallowed with difficulty. He put his fork down on his plate. "Mama, my pie!" That was as far as he got. Lucinda got within a scathing glance and said in an uncertain terms, "Eat your pie, Ernest, and be quiet. Remember what I told you last night." As soon as Ernest tasted his pie, he turned white and swallowed with difficulty. He put his fork down by his plate and said, "Mama, my pie is..." Lucinda gave him a scathing glance and said, in no uncertain terms, "Eat your pie, Ernest, and be quiet. Remember what I told you last night." "But, Mama," protested Ernest, "the pie is..." "Ernest Leslie," shouted his mother. And then, as calmly as she could, she said, "Ernest, you know what I said. Eat your pie and shut up." Ernest ate the pie, and he shut up. But the instant he finished the pie, he jumped up from the table. Without waiting to be excused, he just made a mad dash for the dining room, and outside he went. "What ails that child?" said Mother. But nobody got up and ran after him. They just let him go. Soon it was time for everyone to eat the pie. First Clarence tasted it, and then Lucinda. And then the other tasted it, and then looked questionably at each other. Clarence spoke first. "I believe this pie tastes like soap." "What do you think, Lucinda?" Yes, it certainly does taste like soap," she said. Then everyone agreed that the pie tasted like soap. Oh, God. I remember this story. Lucinda got up from the table and went to the baking cabinet in the kitchen. She opened the cabinet door and called out to Emily, "Look here, Emily. Did you take the dough from this cup? I see it's gone." Yes, said Emily. She picked up a saucer and tried to explain that there was also a roll of dough on that. "Oh, dear," said Lucinda dismayed. "That saucer had a load of laundry soap on it, and I'd forgotten all about it." Then she ran into the yard calling for Ernest. "Ernest! Oh, Ernest!" It didn't take long to locate Ernest, but he didn't look like himself. He came slowly from behind a lilac bush, and the tears rolling down his cheeks, he sobbed, "Mama, I tried to tell you. The pie tastes like soap, but you wouldn't let me, and now, I threw up all of my dinner." "My poor baby," moaned Lucinda. She was beginning to feel sick and extremely sorry for Ernest. She knelt down on the ground to gather Ernest to her. "How do you feel now, dear?" she kept asking him, and Ernest replied he was better. He felt that he was very important with everyone paying attention to him. Ernest got as far as the porch steps and watched all the family bemoaning Ernest's troubles, and then she began to cry all over again and ran back into the kitchen. That was where Clarence found her, with her head down on the table, crying bitterly. "I quit now, she said between sobs. "Heck no, I should say not," said Clarence. "It wasn't your fault. How could you know when somebody would leave a soap around on a dish?" And for some unacceptable reason, he burst out laughing. Emily felt so much better that she mustered up a smile. She began to feel a lot better, and though through the many of the house there was a pretty nice man. The troubles for that day were not over, however. It wasn't long before Lucinda came walking into the kitchen door, was about to tell Ernest that it wasn't her fault about the soap. It wasn't long before Lucinda came walking into the kitchen door. She was about to tell Emily that it wasn't her fault about the soap, and that everything was all right, but before she could say a word, her eyes happened to fall upon a big pan the beans had been baked in. "Oh, Clarence, look. Just look at that pan she baked the beans in. It's not the right pan." She jerked open the cabinet door, and sure enough, there was the bean pan hanging on its nail. "Oh, Clarence, she's baked the beans in the wrong pan. I used that big pan to soak my feet in." She just automatically looked behind the kitchen door, and sure enough, the foot-soaking pan was not on its nail. "What in the world is the matter now?" thought Emily, in Danish. Then she wondered if the whole family might be a bit crazy. They were all running around yelling and hollering. "Emily cooked the beans in Ma's pan she soaks her feet in. Fine thing." In a short time, nothing short of pandemonium reigned. Lucinda began to feel sicker by the minute, and she began moaning to Clarence. "Oh, Clarence, I can't stand it thinking of those beans, and we all ate them. I think I'm going to lose my dinner." Oh. Anyway, she went running out into the backyard of the house like crazy. Clarence followed Lucinda and intended to talk her out of feeling sick, but it was too late. She was highly excitable and nervous, and it didn't take too much for her to have what she always called a nervous stomach. She soon lost her dinner and should have felt better, but she didn't because she was still boiling mad. "Now listen," Clarence said. "You can't blame Emily for this." "Now listen," said Clarence. "You can't blame Emily for this. She isn't any more to blame than getting a hold of the wrong pan than she is for blame for the soap. You can't expect her to know where everything is the very first day. Anyway, you should have set the pan out for her yourself. How can you expect her to know what to do to look for behind?" After talking it over with Clarence, Lucinda began to see that Emily was not to blame for anything, but she was pretty rueful about the whole thing for a while. She said, "Well, anyway, she did wash the pan out good, so I guess it won't kill us." It was a long time before Lucinda could laugh off the incident, but she did eventually, and Emily had only one failing, and that was that she was always waiting for something. Many times Lucinda wanted to find her just sitting on the porch swing or lying in a hammock, and Lucinda would say to her, "Listen, Emily, what are you doing out here when you haven't done the dishes yet?" Inadvertently, wow, that is a tongue twister. Invariably, Emily's response was the same. "Well, I want the water to get hot." Invariably, Emily's response was the same. "Well, I want the water to get hot." Half an hour or so later, she'd still be out there, and she'd say, "The water is not hot, but it is too hot, and I want it to get cold." So it would go. It was the same with ironing days, and Emily rested a lot before her ironing, and it was always because the irons were either too hot or too cold. The irons were heated by being up on top of a red-hot stove, and a wooden handle was inserted into each iron as it was being used. One ironing day, it took the whole day before it was finished. Emily never did washing. The family had a girl for that. Emily stayed with the Fries family for 7 years, and then was married and moved on. In 1913, when she left, she could not only speak English very well, but could also read it well enough that she could read the newspapers. She learned first to read by being taught the words in the cookbook, and she seemed to enjoy it a great deal. Bees in your bonnet. Greenville, about 1906. Clarence Fries decided that he would like to raise bees. But he would never go into something without thoroughly investigating every angle of fun first. Come on. Literally, come on. Clarence Fries decided that he would like to raise bees, but he would never go into something without thoroughly investigating every angle of it first. His preoccupation continued for many years. He was working as a building contractor for an occupation, and took to beekeeping both because he had a bee in his bonnet and because he wanted to ward off trespassers on his property. Since taxpayers had to pay for it, it was noted that whatever information on particular, if any subject one wanted, could be obtained through writing to the government. In the instance of bees, the agricultural department had pamphlets and booklets on the subject, as it did other subjects. He was interested in bees, so he wrote to them, and then he was rewarded with all kinds of information he could get on the subject. He used the information and vigilantly applied himself first to making a hive, according to specifications. He was surprised to see that there was a lot more to it than he thought, but the more he read about bees, the more interested he became. At the time, there was no ordinance that stated that one couldn't keep bees in one's own backyard. He thought everyone was going through his yard, and just as pears were starting to ripen, they would disappear. The same would happen to peaches, apples, and other fruit. It just so happened that recently all of his grapes, all of which there were considerable, had been picked before they got ripe. He felt that something drastic had to be done in order to have any fruit for the family. The trespassers had been so numerous that there was a regular pathway from one street to the other, which was almost like a highway, right through Clarence's yard. Clarence's method of hiving bees was definitely not in the books, because he devised a system of his own. It sort of worked, but it was kind of crazy. First, his outfit was something for the books. He made a lot of screen wire, and he always put them on first. He looked like some kind of creature, with the headgear on. Then he put on big gloves, and the sleeves of his coat were tied around the gloves to keep any bees from getting into his arms. Then he'd let his pant leg tied right around his ankles before putting on his boots. Then he put on his hip boots, the same ones he wore duck hunting. Then when the bees swarmed, he would rush and get a bucket of water, and have whatever children were handy to help. And the procedure went like this. Clarence would toss scoops of water as high as he could up into the bees, and then one child pounded very loudly on a pan. Another grabbed a mirror and placed it in the rays of the sun. The process was supposed to be that the pan banging made the bees deaf, and the water supposed to make their wings so heavy that they couldn't fly. It was a regular parade up and down the streets whenever they were after a hive of bees. Sometimes it meant chasing bees for a while, but they would light on occasion. They were all tracked down until they would light. If the children wondered why it took so long for the bees to light, Clarence Fries would tell them, "Well, you have to get to the queen bee, and either get her deaf, or wet, or blind, and then she'll light, and then the old queen lights, the other bees will follow." It was a perfectly plausible explanation to the children, and it was a matter of record that he never lost a hive of bees. Subsequently, there were 37 hives at strategic places around the yard, and they did indeed discourage trespassers. However, their value was untold. They provided 300 libs of honey every fall, and besides pollinating, they made 2 kinds of honey, buckwheat and planted for them, also a lot of clover, and the bees never mixed the two. The buckwheat made darker honey, and the clover honey, which was white. One day, while the process was underway, and the Fries were madly chasing bees all over town, there happened to be a woman from the city visiting relatives. She was sitting on the front steps of a house across the street, and saw all this going on, and never had seen anything like it. She jumped up from the steps, shaking like a leaf because she was so frightened. She called to her relatives, "Look, there's a crazy man out there, and them children are out, and look what they're doing. They're all crazy." With a laugh there was afterward, because the townspeople were so used to it that they never gave it a second thought. The townfolk were only happy to tell father someone thought he was crazy. He seemed very pleased. Strangely, bees rarely stung any of the children, even when they chased after the bees just as they were, without protection. Father fixed up the elaborate outfit for himself, but just never gave a thought to protecting the children. They had no protection then. Sometimes their legs were bare. Luckily, they were hardly ever stung. Clarence needed his outfit of protection more when he was hiving the bees, as he just scooped them up with his hands a lot of the time, during the hiving process. He figured the children didn't need to do that. He spread out a white sheet on the ground, under the bees, and put a hive on it. Then he would climb up a tree of a long ladder where the bees were and cut off the limb they was on. The big mass of bees looked pretty menacing to the children. They thought that their father was the bravest man in the world. When the limb was cut down, and the big masses of bees with it, father would shake it and scoop them out. After a while, the bees would go into the hive, and if they liked it, as Clarence put it, they stayed. If they didn't, out they would come again, and they'd have to be hived more than once, until they stayed put. Clarence was a building contractor who worked along with his help laying hardwood floors, shingling roofs, etc. By the time father was contracting work for himself, and the children would always go out and get him when he was needed at home for something. Many times he was called out on a roof to go chase a swarm of bees. The beekeeping continued for many years. In fact, when little Estelle grew up and had children of her own, they met with their grandpa's bees firsthand, and her children, Martha and Bobby, got stung on occasion. By then, the Fries had kept a drawer with tweezers and to remove stingers just in case. One time a local child that was allergic to bees got stung once. He got sick for a long time, but then got better, fortunately. Nonetheless, he kept those bees around. The Free Circus. Greenville, Michigan, 1900 through 1916. Big circuses, such as the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey, always came full blast to the little town of Greenville. It was considered a great circus town, and the biggest of them did not pass it by. The circus always brought a full-length parade, the three-ring circus, and Circus Fries put it, with a whole kit and caboodle. The children were excited for days proceeding, and the most ambitious of them always went along 4 o'clock in the morning with their father to see the circus come in. They liked to watch the elephants the most, and took great delight in watching them work. They were surprised to see that the elephants could both push things forward as well as pull things. The boys offered to carry water to the elephants, as much as they wanted, for a free ticket. It usually worked out that they earned their free ticket by working all morning around the elephants in the very hot sun, which they didn't notice. The circus was coming in town again and again. The circus was coming to town again and again, and the children were up bright and early to watch it coming in. Later, at 10 o'clock in the morning, they all went to see the parade. It so happened that no one gave a thought to the fact that the children may have wanted to see. The choice positions were all taken by the adults. All the grandparents in town and the parents were standing tall in front of rows 2 and 3, persons deep. Therefore, the only way the children could see anything at all was to be held up a few minutes at a time. They would catch what they could get, all of the wonders of the flamboyant costumes, and the decorated circus horses, jumbo-sized decorative elephants, and dressed up in humpback camels, too. Clowns and performers and acrobats and people in costume would parade by too. Father spent all of his time boosting one child and then the other up to his shoulders so they could see. It was a bit annoying to him to have to do it constantly, and so he thought he'd do something about it. He thought about it all through the year until it was time for the circus the following summer. His plans were prepared, and he went downtown to talk with his old friend who could help. He also went to the mayor, who accepted his idea, and then he proceeded to put his plan into action. As soon as it was daylight, and the circus was again due to come in, Father was waiting with his usual retinue of children with him. As soon as it was daylight, and the circus was again due to come in, Father was waiting with his usual retinue of children. At first, the opportunity got to see the manager of the circus, and he told him that he was an official in town, which was kind of a little fib on his part. Truthfully, the only political position he could claim was that of the town supervisor. But nonetheless, the manager listened to what he had to say, with great earnestness and attention. Clarence was showing him his street plan. Now, the best way to get to your circus grounds is to turn up this street here, and you'll get there much quicker, and it is a much more direct route. The manager agreed that it looked like a better way than they'd ever before used, so he said they would route the parade up the street on the way to the circus grounds, on the very street the Fries home was located on. The circus was literally going to do a performance in front of the house. The street was not paved, and in case it got dusty, and it usually did, the circus went ahead of the parade and went down the dirt road so it'd be less dusty for the heavy wagons and other circus equipment. So early this morning up and down the street when the father's house was located, went the water wagon and sprinkler. He took his family to the parade, was going to come right by his house, and they didn't tell the manager. Then it was time for the parade to come by, and everyone rushed downtown, except the Fries family. Clarence told each of the children to grab a chair, so they each took their own seat. All the chairs in the house were put in a row on the front lawn. Just before the line for the parade to come, there came Clarence with a nice big rocking chair, and it was placed exactly in the center. He grandly placed Lucinda in the rocker and told her she was going to see the parade in style. When the clowns were right in front of Lucinda, they cavorted before her, and then all the children were in their glory, and they could at last see everything. The elephants plodded along so clumsily. Could there be a twinkle in their eye? Clarence imagined that they looked surprised when they came by and saw the row of strange people, and he said, "Do you know, I believe them elephants remember seeing me down at the train this morning." The Fries children thought the same thing. It was just like having $1 million to just sit in a chair and have a wonderful parade go right past your home, and you could see all of it. A note. Decades later, when Estelle was a grandmother and living in Milpitas, she used to love the parades there too, and the showmen and bands and presentations, and people on horseback, walking and marching and playing instruments. just when she was a child. And I think she did attend the circus once or twice, too.
I raised my saddened heart. He knew its sorrows, bade its doubt depart. Be not afraid, he said, but trust in me. My perfect love shall be shown to thee. And then with lighted eyes and willing feet, again I turned my earthly cross to meet. With forward footsteps turning not aside, for fear some hidden evil might betide, there in the proper anointed way, listening to hear and ready to obey. Across I quickly found a plainest form, with only words of love inscribed thereon. With thankfulness I raised it from the rest, and joyfully acknowledged it was the best, the only one of all of the many there. I could feel that it was for me to bear. Thus I trust my chosen one confessed. I saw a heavenly brightness on it rest. And as I bent my burden to sustain, I recognized my old cross again. But oh, how different did it seem to me, that I had learned its preciousness to see. So when his love seems good to me to send, I'll trust it best, because he knows the end.